At 8:45 a.m. on January 20th, 1953, President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower sat stiffly in the back of a limousine outside the north portico of the White House, refusing to step inside the building where President Harry S. Truman waited. The temperature was a cool 49 degrees beneath an overcast sky, and inside the mansion the outgoing president watched from the window as Eisenhower's car remained defiantly still. Eisenhower had made his intentions unmistakable. He would not enter the White House as a guest, would not share coffee with the Trumans, would not follow tradition, and would instead sit in that car until Truman came out to him, a calculated insult delivered on a morning that should have symbolized the peaceful dignity of democratic transition. Eisenhower, 62 years old, Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, victor of Europe, liberator of millions, the most celebrated American military figure since Ulysses S. Grant, a man courted by kings and prime ministers, who had accepted the surrender of Nazi Germany and commanded millions across continents, had just been elected president with 55% of the popular vote and a crushing 442 electoral votes. Yet on this January morning, he would not take 20 steps to greet the man who had given him nearly everything. Inside stood Harry S. Truman, 68 years old, farmer, haberdasher, judge, senator, vice president. The man who had ordered the use of atomic weapons, confronted Stalin, launched the Marshall Plan, integrated the armed forces, fired Douglas MacArthur, rebuilt Europe, and held the Western Alliance together through the terrifying dawn of the Cold War. Just 7 years earlier, Truman had even offered to make Eisenhower president, offering to step down himself and serve as Eisenhower's vice president if that's what it took. Eisenhower had refused, insisting he was a soldier, not a politician. Yet in 1952 he ran anyway against Truman's party, against Truman's record, and against the administration that had supported him throughout his career. Now he sat outside the White House, forcing Truman to come to him like a subordinate summoned to a curb. CBS correspondent Eric Severide, watching the spectacle unfold, called it simply a shocking moment, and White House usher J.B. West remarked, "I was glad I wasn't in that car. Their bitterness had not always existed. Once they had been allies." Truman had once called Eisenhower the greatest military mind of the age, and Eisenhower had once written Truman with genuine respect. But years of political choices, miscalculations, and perceived betrayals had torn the relationship apart. The first crack appeared in July 1945 when Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's death, drove with General Eisenhower along the Autobahn near Potsdam through the ruins of Berlin, and told him there was nothing he might want that Truman would not try to help him get, including the presidency itself. Eisenhower declined, claiming no political ambitions. Truman accepted that and relied on Eisenhower's leadership, appointing him Army Chief of Staff, awarding him 3 Distinguished Service Medals over the next several years. When NATO formed in 1949, Truman again turned to Eisenhower to serve as its first Supreme Commander, and their working relationship continued professional, not personal, but mutually respectful. Yet Truman's confidence in his own political future faltered, and in July 1947 he offered Eisenhower the presidency again, recording in his diary that he would gladly step aside and serve as Eisenhower's vice president. Eisenhower again refused, insisting he wanted nothing to do with politics. Even when Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal approached him with the same offer at Truman's request, Eisenhower declined, saying he was content to serve at Columbia University or return to military service if needed. Truman, besieged by collapsing approval ratings, a divided Democratic Party, and predictions of a crushing defeat in 1948, still won re-election in one of the greatest upsets in American history without Eisenhower, but with the lingering suspicion that Eisenhower's reluctance might not have been entirely apolitical. That suspicion became reality in 1952 when Eisenhower announced he would seek the Republican nomination. Truman felt blindsided and betrayed. Eisenhower had refused the presidency twice when Truman offered it to him, but entered politics anyway when it benefited him as a Republican running against Truman's own party. But political differences alone did not destroy their relationship. What truly broke it was Eisenhower's failure to defend George C. Marshall, Truman's most trusted advisor and Eisenhower's mentor during the height of McCarthyism. Marshall, the organizer of victory, the man who built the army that won WWII, author of the Marshall Plan, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and the man who had promoted Eisenhower from obscurity to Supreme Allied Commander, became the target of vicious, deranged accusations from Senator Joseph McCarthy, who claimed Marshall was part of a communist conspiracy. Truman was furious. Marshall was, to him, the greatest living American, and he believed Eisenhower above all others should defend him. Eisenhower's Milwaukee speech was supposed to do exactly that. A prepared paragraph praising Marshall and condemning attacks on his loyalty had been released to the press in advance. But under pressure from Wisconsin Republican leaders eager to avoid offending McCarthy, Eisenhower deleted it. On October 3, 1952, before 10,000 people in Milwaukee with McCarthy standing beside him, Eisenhower praised anti-communist vigilance, said nothing about Marshall, and allowed McCarthy to seize his hand and raise it triumphantly for the cameras. The photograph became infamous. The reaction was brutal. Truman called Eisenhower's actions one of the most shocking things in the history of this country and labeled him a coward. Eisenhower, instead of accepting the criticism, grew resentful and convinced himself Truman was using Marshall's honor as a political weapon. Matters grew worse when Eisenhower campaigned in Indiana with Senator William Jenner, who had called Marshall a front man for traitors. Eisenhower knew what Jenner had said, knew the damage it had done, and yet allowed Jenner to embrace him publicly because Indiana was politically important. Truman saw this as unforgivable moral failure. If Eisenhower would abandon Marshall for votes, what else would he abandon? By the time Eisenhower promised during the campaign to go to Korea if elected, implying Truman had failed to end the war, Truman called the pledge demagoguery and a cheap political trick. The campaign descended into open hostility. Eisenhower won in a landslide. When the two men finally met on November 18, 1952, for a transition briefing, the atmosphere was cold and painfully formal. Each man convinced the other held him in contempt. Truman tried to explain the mechanics of the presidency, but Eisenhower listened impatiently, convinced he already knew better. Truman left the meeting predicting Eisenhower would be frustrated as president because the government could not be run like the army. Poor Ike. He'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen in the weeks before the inauguration. Even small decisions like Eisenhower choosing a Homburg hat instead of the traditional top hat felt to Truman's staff like deliberate slights. By inauguration morning, the hatred between the two men was palpable. Eisenhower told associates he wasn't sure he could bear sitting next to Truman for the ride to the Capitol. And Truman's aides said the tension between them was like whether you could feel a political monsoon. And so the moment arrived, Eisenhower sitting in his limousine, refusing to enter Truman's White House, forcing the outgoing president to come to him. A final symbolic rupture between two men who had once admired one another, now divided beyond repair by politics, loyalty, pride, and the heavy cost of choices made in the crucible of the Cold War.